The Witcher, Sirens of the Deep. A movie that is basically a Cronenberg between Disney's The Little Mermaid, Romeo and Juliet, and The Shape of Water. And also the movie we're going to be talking about and learning from today. I think that there's a lot that we can learn from this movie as Dungeon Masters, a lot that we can learn for D&D campaigns, even some things that we can directly steal from this movie that I think would be great in D&D campaigns. But there's also definitely some mistakes this movie made. And I think we're going to be learning some things to avoid on this video. This movie got a 6 out of 10 on most rating sites, and it really felt like a 6 out of 10. It really feels like Netflix is only making movies for Netflix and chilling or something. Netflix, those are radio dramas. Those are radio dramas. That's a podcast, Netflix. You have enough tech bros working for you. You can make a podcast. That's why even make a movie if people aren't even supposed to watch it? Why put in a talking seal? That's like putting in a talking dog. It's a shame. It's a shame this movie had the problems it had, because I have been wanting to make a Witcher-based Dungeons & Dragons campaign for probably a decade now. Still haven't gotten around to it. Hopefully will one day. And so I was excited to watch this movie, excited to make this video, and still am, right? But we're going to be dedicating a part of it to things to avoid instead of, like, things to chase after and put in our games. And that's still useful. We're still going to learn a lot. But I just wish it was better. And before I get into things, I am going to talk about the story a little bit. You don't really need to worry about spoilers. You also don't really need to worry if you haven't seen the movie, because it's basically Disney's The Little Mermaid with some Romeo and Juliet thrown in. Yeah, and specifically, it's specifically Disney's The Little Mermaid. Like, Ursula still has a musical scene in this movie that just comes out of nowhere. It's so weird. And this movie's, of course, based off of the Witcher short story in Sword of Destiny called A Little Sacrifice, right? Little Sacrifice, Little Mermaid. Classic Sapkowski rewriting old fairy tales. It really actually feels like I think this is the last thing I added to my notes here. It really feels like Sapkowski is kind of just like rewriting old fairy tales and putting his OC in them. Like he's when I was thinking about it, it's like he's an original fan fiction writer. He's just rewriting like Hans Christian Andersen stories instead of, I don't know, what do people write fan fiction of today? Supernatural. Also, and by the way, while we're talking about The Little Mermaid, everyone always talks about how she turns into sea foam at the end, and it's really sad. But if you actually read through that story, she does turn into sea foam, but that's part of her process of like turning into an air spirit. And then she gets to go hang out with all the other air spirits and like fly around the world and help people, and has this guaranteed access pass to heaven or something like that. I read a synopsis. I didn't read the actual book. So,
but if you actually read through that story,
and it's one of those weird things where it's like, why are people stopping there? Why are they spreading these lies? And why haven't we gone over characters yet? We have Geralt, the Witcher. We have Dandelion. We have Jaskier. That's right. The Witcher's Bard. And then we have Essie, the Bard's Bard. Then we have Aglaval, the Prince of House Montague. We have Shianaz, the Princess of House Capulet. Zeleste, the Prince of House Poor character arc. And then we have a bunch of other characters that I will probably just refer to as their descriptions because they're not as important. But let's talk about that thing that I liked most, that thing I can really see being useful to us as Dungeon Masters. And that first thing was their use of the world's histories. And I get it, it's impossible to compete with the lore building of a decades-long running fantasy franchise that has 8 books and movies and TV shows and games based off of it. But The Witcher uses a few really simple tools that allow the history of the world to really flow into the story, really lead the story, and really help the story develop. And they're both pretty easy to use and very compatible with a game like Dungeons & Dragons. The first tool is Geralt's immediate recognizability. People see him, they know he is a witcher, they know he is a specific witcher, right? He's the White Wolf. They've heard tale of him, and now the patrons in the inn are making fun of his failings, and there are references being thrown back to the old adventures he has been on, right? We have an immediate reason for a lot of the interactions that he has with people. People are offering him jobs because they know who he is, right? He doesn't have to go around asking for jobs. The story comes to him. The history of the world comes to him. And this is something that I think we see in a lot of fantasy. And it's probably something we see just in a lot of fiction in general, but some fantasy examples immediately came to mind, probably because that's what I like the most, right? We see it in Lord of the Rings when Grima Wormtongue recognizes the Ring of Barahir on Aragorn's finger, right? And he goes and tells Saruman, and then Saruman knows immediately that that's Aragorn, right? The once and future king. That's not Lord of the Rings. That's a book on, that's something totally different. He kind of is the once and future king, though, too. I mean, he's but like that's. Oh, we're getting into King Arthur territory. Anyways, this tool is also pretty extensively used in A Song of Ice and Fire. People are recognizing each other. That allows George R. R. Martin to throw his history in the story, and most of the time it's just hair color. Like, it's I guess that is what it is in The Witcher too. It's Geralt's white hair. Turns out hair color is a huge literary tool, I guess, in the fantasy world. And in all cases, they are used for various plot-related reasons that really make the story feel like it is a part of the history, right? Like the history is affecting the story. But what I liked about this system is it provides immediate access to a world's history whenever is needed, whether you need to read from that history, right? Like bring up some past moments, or write to that history. If a character is very recognizable and people all over the realm know about this character, then when that character does something, word is going to travel fast. Then the next town they go to, people are already going to have heard of what happened in the last town, even though, you know, telephones probably don't exist in your world. But maybe a newspaper does or something. That would be another tool for this as well. I think it's something that really helps with cementing a player character's, right, history in the world, and really getting it so they carve their own path, kind of. And it's something that would be really easy to do in Dungeons and Dragons. All you have to do is give them a very unique magical item. And so when they walk into the innkeep can say, I've only known of one person that carries such a blade. Or maybe it's a blade from your world's history, right? It's a relevant magical item. And so now that innkeep can be recognizing that and giving the players some history on the world, right? Like now your players are walking around with a piece of that history that anyone could recognize at any moment. I think that a lot of dungeon masters, they want to share the lore of their world, the history of the world, but sometimes they struggle to do it. And this is just a freebie like, yeah, share it whenever you want. Your characters are carrying around a piece of that history, right? Like now people recognize it and they can tell them that history. Just such an easy, tangible literary tool. And if you make use of the second tool they used in this movie, a bard of the history, right? You can very easily control that history through the bard's tale for narrative purposes, right? Like you can help or hinder the players at your whim. And I really love the idea of the players having these tales told about them that just get totally out of control, right? Like if you wanted your players to be immediately recognizable, their general, antics are going to be things that spread throughout the world. But if you have a bard elevating those antics to a ridiculous thing, it's going to pull them into higher level quests and get that history into your world, kind of. I say kind of because it's not going to be the exact history. It's going to be an embellished history. But I really think it is useful in telling a story narrative that like really includes the whole world. Both great tools that allow a storyteller or a dungeon master to just really get theirs and their players or their characters' history into the game, into the world, really make that world feel as if it has been existing for ages. And speaking of easy tools, let's talk about Geralt's Medallion. And I know this isn't necessarily something that's restricted to this movie, but this is another thing we see in a lot of fantasy that is hard not to want to add, because it's basically a free foreshadowing device that sits around the character's neck. right? The characters carry this item on them, and it's just like Sting in The Hobbit, or like Spider-Man's Spidey sense. Just a hey, something is weird here. Something is coming. There's danger, right? That never really feels forced because it's a magic object that the players are making use of. And something that is like tangible in the world. This is something I'm kind of recognizing from Sapkowski's story structure style. Is like a lot of his literary tools are tangible objects in the world, which for a game like Dungeons and Dragons works really well. And I know I said this isn't something that's restricted to this movie, so let's talk about something that is. One of the things I liked a lot and kind of disliked a lot, actually, were the clues and mystery aspect of this movie. The Witcher is kind of known for things never really being like they seem, and Geralt is investigating whatever job he has been hired to do to find out what the truth of the matter is, before like making his final call, right? That's something I like about The Witcher a lot. That's something that makes me want to do a Witcher inspired campaign, right? And in this movie, they had many of the clues be very subtle, which gave a nice slow buildup of anticipation. The pacing was very nice. And then they just like gave you the last clue, and it felt like a giant red flag, kind of. That feels like it throws all of the other clues away for the most part. And that ends up ruining the big reveal at the end. And if you're doing a sort of mystery at the tabletop and just gave the answer away at the end, I feel like it would feel like the player's time had been wasted. Like they had just worked on a bunch of stuff for no reason. And so I think there needs to be kind of a balance there of what sort of clues you give and what sort of deductions the players make. And speaking of balances in this movie, things being balanced, let's talk about my next point. And I'm not going to spoil anything, but at the end, there is a big battle, right? That's going to be pretty typical of any genre that involves swords and magical beasts and a magical man hunting magical creatures, right? There's probably going to be a fight at the very end, at the climax of the movie. But during this battle, like story beats are kind of going off, things are being revealed. The battle is itself a story. And in a game of D&D, during our encounters, I feel like that this has the possibility to be a great tool for dungeon masters who want to add like a little more excitement to what's going on. And I'll explain why I say it's a possibility to be a great tool, because I think that it can either help us a lot, make our battles more exciting, or it can hinder us a lot and make our battles feel like a slog. Because in The Witcher, right, in The Witcher Sirens of the Deep, there are great points in the battle where the story is developing, characters are growing, the plot is moving along, like things are still excited, swords are clashing. At one point, sides even kind of change, which is exciting. Old enemies are like new allies now. There's a little low point type event, a little like will they make it type event. But there is just a ton of monologuing going on during the fight. There's too much of the villain announcing what they're going to do while the main characters are setting up to defeat them, right? Too many moments where the battle is basically put on pause, or the characters are standing there while people are just like waiting to jump after them, right? There's a group of enemies just right behind them, and they're saying something that is relevant and important to the story, but it's not really believable in the context of what's going on. And you can see it with the animation that they're just standing in a big battle, not doing anything. And this might work a little better in a tabletop setting where the battle is already sort of paused in a way, but I think there needs to be some believability to the battle, like fight and talk, don't just stand there. And if I were trying to do something like this as a dungeon master, it would really need to be short and quick. Like, we already spend so much time at the tabletop with turns and reading through like what features we're using during our attack and rolling and stuff. And it's like, if we add more talking and story beats into that, we really risk ourselves and the table just slowing down and getting a little stagnant. And so I think that in movies, right, like The Witcher, and at the tabletop, like in games of Dungeons and Dragons, you really need to make things quick and just like get the action moving, and if that action involves some story, keep that story part of the action. Have some sort of situation where maybe the villain gets hurt and that is relevant to the story beat itself, like that is a clue or something. So I like the idea. The execution was okay. Could have been tighter, but this is what put the final pieces of the puzzle together in a little bit more of an exciting way. I think maybe just the pieces of the puzzle were too large. And speaking of things that could have been done better, we need to talk about all the inconsistencies in this movie. If there's something a dungeon master needs to do at a table, it is be consistent, right? This is where immersion and believability can just easily break down if there's inconsistencies in a game. And in Witcher, Sirens of the Deep, so much was not consistent. The characters were not consistent. The power scaling was not consistent. The ship that was blasted with Ignis and then just wasn't burnt didn't even have any steam from the water, right? And the characters in this movie will just suddenly change their mind about something at the drop of the pin. The pin, the literary pin. They'll just change their mind about something at the drop of a pin. And I think this was probably due to time constraints of the movie. But nearly every relationship breaks down at some point in this movie. And I think they were just trying to make things like extra dramatic. And it just really instead seemed like they were kind of flippant about the mildest things. And I think for us as dungeon masters, if we want to push our NPCs in a certain direction, like get a little bit of conflict going with the players, we really need to make sure it's a good reason. Because if it's not, it really just ruins all character believability. And the characters in the movie just lost all senses of themselves at point of like who their characters were. And that can be a pitfall that we as dungeon masters can fall into when we're trying to make stories that are like engaging and fun, is we accidentally make characters lose all sense of themselves. So that's something that this movie messed up on that we need to be aware about. I also mentioned the inconsistencies in the power scaling. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. There's a point where Geralt fights a single Vodnik, right? You're probably familiar with them. You've probably fought them in the game, right? And he needs a potion. He barely wounds it. And then later he's fighting 2 or 3 at a time. Zeleste, the captain of the guard, who is just a normal guy, right? He's he fights very well, right? But he defeats 2 in a few seconds, just like 1, 2. And I get it, right? Like the one Geralt fought had a fun cape and a scarred eye, but do they not have more of these specialty Vodnik with the scarred eye and the cape to go after Geralt? Like if they sent 4 of those guys after him, he probably wouldn't survive. And even the other ones have these like wildly different power scales. Like one bites through plate armor at a point, and then later Jaskier is holding off like 3 at a time, even though he's a bard, right? And probably has never picked up a sword. I don't know if he's picked up a sword in any Witcher, any Witcher media I have seen, at least. I don't remember if he picks up a sword in the book. That would be I don't know. Maybe I should have looked that up. Someone out there knows. And I thought we learned not to do this after all those old fantasy games where you would spend forever like fighting a boss, and then you'd go into the next room and that boss would just be like 6 normal dudes with different abilities that the boss didn't have, or they wouldn't have the boss's old abilities. And it just ruins believability for the movie. Like you can kind of get around this in a tabletop setting since the players are leveling up and gaining new abilities, right? But when it's just so sudden, it's one scene, he's having a ton of trouble fighting this magical creature, right? This, I don't know, magical enemy, this Vodnik. And then in the next scene, he's fighting a bunch at once. And it's like, did he just magically level up 5 levels in that time? Like it just, it was not consistent. And I think it shows us that consistency is really important when it comes to making a believable setting and a believable game. And I think this is a problem that's unique to The Witcher, Sirens of the Deep, right? I don't think this is a Witcher problem. I think that this is this movie problem. And since we're talking about things I didn't like in this movie that I think can be pitfalls for us as dungeon masters, this movie made really poor use of a lot of bad cliches. And I think that putting too many cliches in D&D can just kind of make your players' eyes roll. We have plot armor and lack of plot armor, and guys dying right before they can give some critical information. And then there's the villain speech I already talked about. I'm not a fan of villain speeches. I think they're boring. I've said that in other videos. But then we also have the super tough enemy becoming a regular guy. And it just, and I don't think it's necessary about putting cliches in or not. I think a lot of these would have worked if they had just let them develop naturally. But I think that's kind of the thing about cliches, is it's often not that they are a cliche that feels annoying, it's that they feel so out of place. I think they often end up in media just because we have seen them so many times that that's what immediately comes to people's minds. They think, oh, well, this is the natural progression of the story. That guy dies right before he can give that critical information. And it's like, well, but it needs to be believable. And I think as dungeon masters, we have to recognize this. We have to recognize we can't shoehorn in a specific scene in a wider narrative if it's not supposed to be there, right? Because it's going to feel like a cliche, and we can't just replay scenes that we liked from another movie or TV show for the same reason, right? I think if we force it, it's going to feel forced. The players are going to recognize that, and it's often going to end with them feeling like a little cheated. It's going to make their eyes roll, right? They're going to be like, oh, this again, another guy has died right before we can get critical information from him. How many times is this going to happen? And those same feelings were the feelings I had during a lot of the scenes of this movie. Is like things just felt a little out of place, a little unbelievable, kind of made my eyes roll, kind of made things feel a little annoying, either due to like lack of continuity or cliches or just everything feeling like it was being forced for plot related reasons. But there were some good lessons from it, of course, and whether that be useful narrative items or what not to do in a game, hopefully you learned something. If you did, let me know somehow. Maybe in the comments, I guess, or call me. Don't do that. Don't find my number on the dark web. But thank you so much for watching. My name is Wes. This is my dog Prismo. He is sitting in the back like always, waiting to go outside. And this is TabletopWriter, where I talk about the traditional and non-traditional methods of writing through the lens of tabletop gaming. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye. I think that... Hey, Prismo, itchy boy. You're gonna get a bath today, itchy boy. He has allergies.